Hi, welcome to week 4 of our JavaScript course. In the last two chapters of the book, we have learned how we can code some simple but simplified and unrealistic applications using the prompt method to get user entries. Now, in this module, we are going to learn how to work with objects like text box objects, and we will get user entries as well as the objects that let us work with numbers, dates, and strings. We will also learn how to code blocks of statements called functions, and we will learn how to respond to events that occur when users perform actions like clicking on a button, or when events can occur, such as when a page is loaded. you know when you finish this module, you should be able to start developing useful applications of your own. So I'm not going through the objectives over again, but basically we will be using the JavaScript specifications uh, to code, test, and debug the application. Our main objective remains the same, but we will jump into versatile topics. So we will be able to do some event-driven things, event-driven development within the JavaScript, and also we will learn how to use the functions, and we will use the inbuilt functions as well as user-defined functions. Okay, so let's proceed. So, uh, I mean, in the previous chapter, an object, as we learned, is a collection of methods that do actions and properties that contain data and that relates to the object. As we have already seen, JavaScript provides objects that you can use inside your code. The objects that JavaScript provides are divided into two main categories. One is the host objects, another is the host objects is the part of the environment that JavaScript runs in. For example, it runs in the browser. The browser is the host environment. Keep in mind though, JavaScript can also run outside a browser, such as when it runs in the Node.js runtime environment. The window and document objects that you already learned, they are the host objects and are the navigator and history objects. There are a couple of other objects, navigator and history. If you look at the descriptions of these objects in this table, you can see that they all provide for working with the browser in the same way. Host objects are not part of the ECMAScript specification. The second category of object consists of JavaScript native or built-in objects. Okay, so the native objects that are within the JavaScript itself. I mean, uh, when you develop a coding language, programming language, you define a system. Basically, you define an ecosystem. So these objects that you see here. These are called native objects. So these are within the ecosystem of the JavaScript. Okay, so these are the built-in objects. These objects are provided by JavaScript language, as I said, and part of the ECMAScript specification. Some of these objects, like object and the function object, are fundamental objects that other objects are based on. For instance, all JavaScript native objects inherit the base object, which means that they have access to objects properties and methods. So you will learn more about it later, but right now let's say that all the objects that we are going to work within the JavaScript framework, they are all derived from the object. the first one, as you see in the slide, the first one, this is the object, so it is the base object. The other native objects in this particular table that you can see, they represent specific structures or data types. So those are specific for the data types. For instance, the array object represents a collection of values or elements. The date object represents a date, and the number object represents the numeric data type. So within the data structure framework, within the framework where we describe the data structure, the data types are very important, so that's why we are using these array, date, function, number, string, boolean, math, whatever we noted here are part of the data structure. Now, string, number and boolean native objects correspond to string, number and boolean primitive data types. That's because these objects are wrapper objects for those primitive data types. So what's a wrapper object? A wrapper object is one that contains another object or data type and provides properties and methods for working with it. Normally, you do not need to know the difference between the primitive data type and their corresponding wrappers, or make decisions on when you should be using one rather than the other. JavaScript automatically converts a primitive type to its wrapper object when you call a method, and then discards the wrapper object when the call is done. So you can see that you can, let's see in this picture, in this not the picture, in this layout, you can see that we are calling certain objects. Basically, what are we doing here? So what we are doing here is we are referring a numeric literal, which is a primitive data type and which is assigned to a constant named pi. But you can still call the toFixed method of the number object with this constant. Okay, so that is the that's the reason you are using the wrapper object, that you can have a way to manipulate those objects. The wrappers provide that infrastructure for any data type. So what we have learned here, basically these are some terms related to the object, that is the object itself. The property, method, host object, native object, wrapper object, utility object, all those things that we have learned here. So the whole examples of the host objects, again, the examples of the host objects include they are provided within the browser environment. For example, as I said, you can run JavaScript outside the browser just like a Node.js application, but in general the host objects, examples of the host object include window, document, navigator, history. Some of the JavaScript native objects are object, array, date, function, and so on. So what's the difference between host object and the native object? The host object, as you can see, they are all about using the JavaScript, applying the JavaScript. But the native objects, they are related to the data structure which is built in specific for the JavaScript programming language. So it's a part of the programming language, but while the other is an extension of the JavaScript programming language that is used for applications. So the host objects are specific for the applications, whereas the native objects or built-in objects are specific for the using the JavaScript, the coding, programming with the JavaScript. So you can see that another method of the Windows object that displays a dialog box is like confirm string. So what is that? Let's go into some detail about the confirm object or confirm window object, how to use that. So the confirm, we are talking about the confirm dialog box. So it is very simple. Let us give an example here. So in this example we are basically running the same mile per gallon application. In order to understand these things, you don't have to construct a very complicated application. A simple application should be good enough. So as usual, you can see that HTML, and then HTML has the head, and then you have the body, and finally you include the script just below the body, at the end of the body element, just outside the main section. Remember, we are using HTML5. So so this is the button. So that means whenever you do some calculation, this button will click. Button will be clicked, and we will talk about the events later, but let's see what does the JavaScript do. So JavaScript basically it handles some events. We will talk about event later, but you can see that we are calling the process entries. Whenever we click the mouse, we are calling the process entries. And the process entries, we are using the confirm dialog box. We are asking, you are trying to calculate the MPG. So do we calculate MPG? That type of question. This is just for illustration purpose. So let's try to run this application. Again, this is the VS Code, and you can run it from within the VS Code. So this is your run and debug button. So you click there and you click run and debug, and that way you will get to it. So we get this popped up here. So this is the window that is the HTML file. Let's write the miles driven. Let us say 100 miles, and gallons of gas used. Let us say 3.5 gallons gas was used. Now if you click calculate MPG, you see this confirm dialog box is popping up. So we say okay. If it is okay, then it will go and calculate it. If you do cancel, it will not do that. So if you do okay, then it is just doing its calculation. Whatever calculation it needs to do, it does it, and that's it. So that's the application of the confirm dialog box. So it is almost same as what we are displaying here. We used a different example, whereas the book used different example, but they all makes the same. We are reflecting on the same concept. So there are two methods of the Windows object for working with numbers. Namely the parse int and parse float. So you can convert the strings to number as well. So basically we have done it before, right? We used a string. What we mentioned earlier, that in the world of HTML everything is string, but whenever it goes to the processing, means whenever it goes into the JavaScript area, then we apply all those parsing logic. So JavaScript provides us with some parse inbuilt functions, the built-in or the native function, this parse in, parse float, these are the native functions. And here actually what we are doing, we are using a prompt, and then we are basically prompting whatever value in the prompt to integer. So it will ignore the decimal places, so it will only show the integer places. And on the other hand, if you parse it with the float, then it will show the decimal places. That's all we are doing with the parse int and parse float functions. So note that both of these functions are applied only to the strings. Okay, so there are three methods of the document object. I mean, there is a query selector all, and write. So we have already dealt with some examples of these. Let us try to find out some more examples. So in this application, this is the miles per gallon application. It's a different version. It's not event driven. It's very simple, straightforward. So here also you can see that we are including the JavaScript uh, at the end of the body. I mean, within the main section. So in the MPG, I mean this in this JavaScript actually we are using that document write. I mean, you can see that the document write usage of the document write object. So document dot write, basically it does all the, I mean, it does everything to write the content onto the HTML page from where the JavaScript is being called. Now you can see here the parse float, the usage of the parse float function. So we are using the miles. I mean, you are entering the miles driven through the prompt. So prompt means it is given to the users to enter some values. Then the gallons, I mean, you can use that as well. So there are two integers we get, but then you can do the, I mean, you can do the miles per gallon. So when you do the miles per gallon, then you do the float. I mean, basically miles and gallons, when you divide them together, you are passing the result of that division as a float value. So you get the decimal points. And then you see here that we put two fixed two. That means we are displaying the result up to 2 decimal points. Okay, so that's how we are using it. And then document write basically handles the writing of the results back into the HTML page. Let's see how it works. So if we just run the code, web app, and then we see here, so the prompt appears. So let's write the enter miles driven 100, and then gallons of gas, let us say 4, and then we get repeat entries. Let's say no, we are not trying to repeat any entries, we are just displaying one result. So you see here that 25.00, so 0.2 zeros, so that means the 2 decimal point. If you do it over again and put some decimal point numbers, let's see what happens. So let's say 100 miles driven and number of gallons is 3.5. Okay, and we do okay, and then no repeat n, and then you can see that we are displaying the result up to 2 decimal points. If you do it float 3, I mean, for some reason if you want to display it up to 3 decimal points, it will do that. I mean, like if we change the code, put it, let us say 4 decimal points, and then if we run the code again, let's see, let's stop this one, and now we can run it. And if we run it, you can see it comes up here. So 100 and then 3.5, and no, I mean, we are not repeating. So you can see this is the result is displayed up to 4 decimal point. So two fixed is basically how many decimal points do you want after these particular, I mean, after doing this mathematical operation. So we understood, right? We understood the application of parse float, parse int, and then the document write, and also the two fixed, so the inbuilt functions. So we are learning about the JavaScript functions. So tell me, what is the host function here and what are the native functions here? Okay, so we are using the host functions like when we display like the prompt, we are using the what is that, I mean, the document. These are the host functions, whereas parse float, parse int, two fixed, these are the native functions. So these are internal to the JavaScript language, whereas the other, the document and those, I mean, parse, I mean the prompt, those are related to, those are also part of JavaScript, but they are applicable for their applications, how you are using it. So it is specific to how you are using it in a given browser. Okay, so That's the illustrative example for whatever we have learned so far. Okay, so I mean you can do, I mean selector is a great tool for the JavaScript. You can do a lot of ways to do the to code the selectors, and we are going to study the selectors right now. So in order to illustrate the usage of the selector, we are running a different application, and in fact that is one of your assignments in this lab for this module. So one of the assignment is you were asked to basically enhance the miles per gallon application. So what you have to do is that I mean basically you have to do a clear entries function, enhance the application so the entries are clear when the user double clicks in the miles per gallon text box. Enhance the application so the miles driven text box is cleared when it receives the focus. Then do the same for the gallons of the gas used text box. Enhance the application so that the calculation is done when the focus leaves the gallon of gas used text box. So I mean basically you have to do it using the selectors. So here is how you can lay out your application. So basically you generate an index.html file. So it is provided with your starter code. Within the zip file you will find it. So you can see here for example we are using input type text and we are defining the IDs of the inputs. So selectors are specific. I mean you can use the selectors to select the specific IDs within your document. In our case, within the scope of the JavaScript, the document is basically your HTML file, and the select, by using selectors you are specifying, you are basically selecting specific IDs inside your document or inside your HTML file. So for example, you have these divisions, div elements, and inside those div elements you have the IDs like miles, mpg, the calculate. I mean each of the element has an ID, identification, so that you can use the selectors. Here is how these selectors are manipulated. So you can, we first define a selector object, and we are defined basically query selector and selector. It is basically a on the fly thing. We will define what selector we are going to use. So that is basically chosen at the focus and select whichever area we want to focus. That area we will select and we will apply that selector there. Okay, so what is happening here is for example when you when you when you do the application, let's say you just load the document, you do the calculation, then you click the calculate button and you hit the process entries, and here's how you are selecting specific areas, you know. So what is going on here, if your miles are not there, then you focus and select the miles section. So basically you are applying this selector object to the miles section. So miles section is selected so that you can do whatever is needed on the miles section. Then if the gallons is empty, then your focus is going to basically to the you are selecting the gallons section, gallons selector, so gallons element. And same way you can do it for different elements. Okay, and you can also use the selectors to do the focus. So let's see how the application works. So now if you just run the application, so you can see here we can choose the web home, the Chrome, Google Chrome, and then you can see that application is displayed. So let's say we do not enter anything on the miles, and we put, like, let us say 4, I mean how many gallons of gas to use, let us say 4 gallon, and we do not put the miles. If you do the calculation, it will basically do this one, miles driven must be a valid number, and then you are selecting using the selector your this miles ID is selected and this comes into the focus. You understand how do we use the selector, right? So go back to the JavaScript. So we are applying this. So whenever is nan miles is activated, so at that point we are basically uh, alerting, we are basically raising this error message miles driven. And then we are, I mean, what is this error message? It is a miles driven must be a valid number. This label is referred here, miles driven, this is the label. And then we say must be a valid number. So label becomes label and with must be a valid number. And as soon as we we register that particular error message, because this is an alert, right? So we, as soon as we get that, then we go to the focus, I mean we select that particular miles id, miles section, and then that part comes into focus. So this is the way you should be using the selector within the scope of the JavaScripts. So let's move on to the application. Let's run it over again. uh, if we do that, then you come here. Oh, that's wrong, that's wrong. So we need to delete the launch.json, because we are supposed to run only the HTML, not the JavaScript. Many of you have done these errors. I told you that you should run always the index.html or the HTML file, not the JavaScript file. If you run the JavaScript file accidentally, you will be, I mean this VS Code will automatically generate a JSON file for set up your environment, and then you will run into issues when, if you don't clean up that file, if you don't delete that file basically. And okay, that's fine. So let's now see this one. So let's say miles driven is 100, but gallon is not given. So if you calculate the mileage, it will alert, and we will select this particular area, gallons section, and this will come into the focus, so that the user can put some number here and then calculate gallon, and you can see the miles per gallon. And then the clear entries, let's go back to the clear entries code as we have done. So the clear entries, basically what it does, it literally clears all the entries. So what it does, so it again I mean selects the miles section. So it is using the selector, it selects the miles section and finds its values, and then what it does, it sets the values to empty string. Again, I mean we were talking about the HTML. Within the area of HTML, everything is a string. So that is re-emphasized here. If you don't use the string here, then you will get error. So you should use the empty string here. So there are, I mean there may be some applications where you would require to put some default values. This is the place where you are supposed to enter the default values. Anyways, so if we just run the HTML file over again, I'm deleting the previous entries. Let's run it over again and we will see this one. Let's say 100 and 4, and then calculate mpg this one. Now if we clear the entries, everything is cleared. So this is your application within your lab 1 for this week. So we have worked out this lab within the classroom. So refer to this lecture for getting hints, or just get your solution basically. uh, you can take a screenshot from my screen, and then you can move on and create your own application. But I recommend you write your application. If you are stuck, then you come back here and just look at the lecture multiple times, you will find the solutions. So going back to our presentation, so I mean we have shown you basics of the selector, but here is the descriptive way you can use. I mean in fact you can utilize these definitions to define your own selectors within the applications. So you can see the using a descended selector, it is like that, query select all, you can do that. Using a combination of selectors, you can do this. Using multiple selectors, you can use the multiple selectors as well. I recommend that you try everything within your code. And you can how to write a line of HTML into the document. Basically, that's what we did in our application. So for the text box object, there are two methods, focus and select, and the two properties, values and disable, and one method of the number object. We have used these things, that is to fixed. And then HTML tags that define two text boxes are basically, you see here the input, and we are using the first name ID, I mean the sales amount. I mean, this is an arbitrary application, so we put the reference to that. So how do you use the value property to get the value from the text box? So you get query selector. You are referring to the first name, ID equals first name, so first name section, and you get populate the value from there. And if you do some kind of chaining, I mean this above statement can be chained together. So you can do first name equals document query selector dot value. So here, I mean, it's pretty apparent, because if you don't do the chaining, you could do it in steps, but here you can do the chaining. It is much straightforward and much of an inline application that you can use. Okay, so how to use the parse float method, we have done it already, but you can see here without chaining you can do it in this way. So you first define the sales amount, document dot query selector, and then you go to the sales amount section, and then you define the sales amount as sales amount dot value, and then you do the parse float. But if you do the chaining, you can shortcut everything. You can parse float, and then you can basically do document dot query selector sales amount dot value. I mean, there is no good way or bad way of writing the code. It all depends on your comfort level. Whatever way you want, you can write it. But I recommend that you practice these chaining and without chaining methods within your code, so you learn. So other examples of chaining are also given here. Um, I mean, I'm insisting that you do some practice. So here we have used basically, you can see here we have used functional representation, and we did use some kind of chaining somewhere, as opposed to, see here we did the selector dot value. So we did not do any chaining here, because we had to use the gallons elsewhere. So instead of gallons, you could have put parse float, this one, over and over again, but we don't want to do that. So that's all we wanted to, uh, we want to make sure that you learn this one. So how to create a JavaScript object, you can do, uh, the syntax for creating an object is basically the variable name equals new object. So a statement that creates a date object is today equals new date, and then you will find the date. Let me work out some example here. So we want to display the dates, right? So if we want to do that, let's do it is as follows. So we are using the same code. So this is our HTML file, right? Index.html. So wherever we want to put the date, let's do the following. Let's define a paragraph object p. So inside this object, let's define p id equals date. This is the date section. Okay, now what you can do, you can define a scriptlet. So you write a script. So this is an inline script that we are going to provide. Okay, so we are doing that. Now inside the script, what you are going to do, let's follow the instruction, that is constant d equals new date. That's what we are going to do. And then we can do, so today's current date is displayed, I mean created. So now we can do document get element by id. Okay, so what is the id? Date, right? And then you can do the inner HTML. So this inner HTML, so HTML inside this date section would be date. Okay, so let's complete it and then let's run it. If we run it, we will see this one. See here, the date is displayed. So that's how you're going to use the date object inside the JavaScript. Okay, so there are many methods of the date object that you could use, like to date string, to get full year, get date, get month. So if you once you define these objects, you can go through different variations of the date. Okay, so you can do multiple properties of the string object. Like one property is the length. So string is an object, and so you can basically manipulate the string. So what you can do, you can choose any object that you are displaying, and then you can comfortably change. I mean, basically you can modify the the uppercase to, I mean, lowercase to uppercase, the length, I mean, whatever you want, you can do this using the string manipulation function. So these are the terms that we have learned just now. And the syntax of a JavaScript function description is very simple. You write function, that is the keyword of the JavaScript, then the function name, which is a text or which is a string, and then you specify the parameters. So then you write down the statements that will run when the function is being executed. Okay, so in the JavaScript you can do the declaration. I mean, you can use no parameter at all. So in the function declaration, for example, here show year, you can do today, and you can do the new date, and you can alert year is get full year, and you can call the function by simply calling its name. That's the syntax for calling the function. So as an example, we can use this script, right? We can reuse this script. I mean, the first one, the email list. So this is basically entering a form of different emails, and then you call the email list.js. So here what you can do, basically here, inside the clear form part, you can define a function called show date. Let's say when you clear something, you are going to show the date. So this is just an example. So we have already done how to define the date. We are creating an alert. Today is whatever date it is. We do that, and then we call it in the beginning. So the use case is when you clear the form, the date will be popped up. So let's run this program. So if you do that, you will get this one. So run and debug. So you get this one email address. Let's say test@test.org. I'm just giving some arbitrary email address. These are not real email address, and the username is test, let us say. And then you clear the form, and then you see here the today is whatever date. So basically we popped up, so we called a function. So what did we learn here? That is important, that here we see that a function is called in this way. Function is the keyword. It's blue in VS Code. It's a keyword for JavaScript. You cannot use the function name as the function. Then you have the function name. It is a simple string, and whatever content you have in the function. Then when you call the function, you have to just call it using these arguments. In this case, we did not use any arguments. You could change, I mean, like you can use another function where you can put like something like this. I mean, show date, and then not show date, you can do uh, show message, and then you can say that you may choose to do like this. For example, you can say that first name is first, the entries for, so show message, you can do the message first of all. Then you can do alert, whatever message it we have here. Okay, so now when you call this function, you can do it in this way. show date, and you can do you can do that show message. You can say that now you can specify your parameters, that entries for, then you can do like this one, whoever that person is, their this value, and then you can say is cleared. Okay, so then we close this statement. Now let's go back. So we are doing the show message. This is the parameter, so we are using the parameter, and go to the index.html, and then you run it again. So when you run it, you will see that we get it here, test at test.org. The same thing, you have to use the same email address because you are confirming it here, and then you can say uh, my name. Okay, that's an arbitrary name. So you see the first one is the page, and second one, entries for my name is cleared, and it is cleared. So that's how we code. I mean, we call the functions. So here we have learned how to use the functions in the JavaScript. So here you can see that two functions we have defined. First one does not have any argument. Second one has one argument. You can specify multiple arguments. In fact, you can combine these two functions. You can say that I mean, basically you don't need to do that specifically. You can do function constant, whatever the new date, and I mean, you can specify other functions, I mean other message elements as well. The if you want to do anything else there, so you can do it there. That's it. So a function declaration with one parameter that returns, so that's what we did here. And how to call the function, I mean, that's the way we call the function. That's, you learned it, right? I mean, that's what we did. Function can be named as the name of the selector itself. I mean, that way you can do, I mean, you can basically, this is an advanced way of declaring the functions. We have done it already. So I mean, it's different variations. You can see the two arguments instead of one that we showed you. You can do the function expression. You can actually, function means you can basically do the, you can use the function as the expression as well. So basically the function expression with no parameters that does not return a value, it is something like that. You can call it in this way. That's what we did, right? And function expression with one parameter that returns a DOM element, so you can do it in this way, constant, and you do dollar equals function selector, and you do, I mean, basically it's an inline function. And you can see that how do you call the function. I mean, basically you do that, and just the selector, call by the name of the selector dot value, and that way you will get the email. So it's pretty simple, inline and pretty simple. You can use the function expression using two parameters that returns a value. I mean, it's quite obvious. The syntax of the arrow function is basically, you can do the constant names parameters. So it means the statement that run when the function is executed. The code for a function expression is pretty simple. You can see here, I mean, you have the constant, I mean, calculate tax and then equals function. So it's a functional interface. So you are defining the function inline, and you are equating it to a value, to a constant. So otherwise you would have, what you would have done, you would have defined a function like that, and then you equate that value. And another thing you should note, that so far we have defined multiple functions. There are two types of functions. One that does not return anything. Here it is producing an alert, but here you can see it is returning some value. So that means there are two types of functions: value returning function and non-value returning function. So when you write the code, you have to put proper perspectives. Like if you want a function to return some value, then you have to specify like that. I mean, you have to make sure that you are basically mention that what value it is returning. Okay, so that's how we are doing it. So we have learned a lot of things here, like the function, I mean calling a function, function declaration, parameters, argument. Usually if you use multiple values, when you declare the function you use the parameter. When you call the function, that's when you use the argument. Those are the two ways of telling what are the values you are passing. So then the passing parameters, you learn the return statement and so on. So I mean you can have the two, I mean you can have global variables, you can have the var adds tax rate property to the window object. And let, if you write let tax, let does not add anything to the window object. So when you do let, then it does not add anything to the host object or window object. If you use a variable var, then only it adds a property to the windows object. A function that uses the global variable is pretty simple. You can use it in that way. Global, when you use a global variable, you are not obligated to define the variable type inside the function specification, because it is accepting the global variables. So a function that uses local variables, there you must declare the variable explicitly. So you can use constant, I mean constant tax, and then you can do that. For the global you don't need to, but for the constant you have to do that. A function with two loops. So basically if you have the function scope, you have the var, you have to define the var. But if you have it in the block scope, then you do the let, and then j is not in scope. I mean outside the for loop, j does not have any scope, so it is gone. So if you, this is something new, right, compared to other language. When you define a for loop, no one remembers, I mean you don't remember about I outside the loop. But here if you declare it as a var, why? Then you can remember it. Why? Because it's a global variable. Global variables are declared with var. But if you do the let is basically the local variable, and you forget it outside the scope. So that's a very important concept in the JavaScript. What is the difference between var and let? Var stands for a global variable, whereas let is just a local variable. So outside, I mean once you define a var, then it is common to everything within that same JavaScript file. But if you define a let, its scope is within that particular block where you are defining it. So let's talk a little bit about the events. I mean there are different events associated with JavaScript. Like Windows, the common events is load the document, DOM content loaded, button is a click event, control or link, I mean focus, blur, control can be change or select, element can be click, double click, mouse over, mouse in, mouse out. I mean these are the common events in the JavaScript. So when you do the coding with the event, the normal way is define the target, and then you do the add event listener. So the same thing we have done here, right? So for example, in the MPG code, we have, in the JavaScript, we have added a event listener to the DOM content loaded, whatever DOM content we have loaded. So once we do the calculate, we do add event listener click. I mean the click event is associated with calculate, the click event is associated with clear, the miles is associated with the double click, the clear entries, miles is also the focus. So I mean you can see here, for example, if you run the code, what happens? If you run the code, you go there. So If you double click, it is focused, right? I mean, that's what it is happening. If you double click, it is focused. So you can do, um, let's run it again. Oh, so let's clean up this launch.json. We don't need it. um, Delete. That's it. And then index.html and then run it again. So here you can do test. Miles driven is 100. This is 4. So now it is in the calculate MPG is related to the click event. So once we click, that event is triggered and calculation is happening. Now if we double click it, it is gone. Okay, so that's how it works. So here you can see the double click, I mean clear entries. If you double click on the miles, it is associated with the clear entries. Once you double click again, you create the application. Again there is a mistake, so we have to delete this one. Okay, so now we go to index.html, we run the code, and we come here, we do 100, let's say 5. It's a very bad car, I would say. Then calculate mpg, we found here. Now we double click. Single click is basically focus and double click is clearing the entries. So that's what happened here, right? So it's pretty clear. I mean, when you have the selector, the miles selector, and you double click, then it is equivalent to clearing the entries. If you go to the miles selector and if you focus, I mean basically it is associated. If you go to the selector, basically it is associated with the focus. So it is like this. I mean, you do this. uh, Let us delete it, and then you go index html, run, and then you can see this is the focus. Versus you write something, do something here, and you do calculate mpg, and then single click is focus, double click is clear. Okay, that's what it is done. Okay, so that's what we have done for the event handler. So you can use a function expression as the event handler. This is the way you do a you can do the show message, and then you can do that way. So here you, for example, you do the show message, exactly what we have done in our code, something similar to that. So here we this is what we have done. Constant, I mean this one, focus and select, it's a function. It's a selector. Basically we have defined is this one, process entries. This is a function. So then we call it here. So we have handle DOM content load event code that we use the function expression as the event handler, exactly the same way whatever we have done in this code, to calculate the miles and also calculate the mpg and then do the associated stuffs. So that's the way we do the function expression as the event handler. You can use an anonymous function as the event handler. So this is the way we use the anonymous function. So anonymous function means you don't have to mention its name. You can put the arguments and that's all. Okay, this is the functional representation in the JavaScript. So you can do the code that attaches a click event handler. So that's what we have done, right? We have done it in this particular example. We attach the click event handler, we attach the double click event handler, and also the focus event handler. So we have used multiple event handlers in this particular function. Okay, so common HTML elements that have default actions that click event. So basically A is default action is load the page. If you have the input, you do submit the form if the type attribute is set to submit. If you have the input, you can reset the form if the type attribute is set to reset. Button is submit the form if the type attribute is set to submit. So that the way, I mean you can use the reset button as well. Basically you can have this kind of form, and you can see that form action is join.html. So that way you can this is the way you can use the form selection, and that's the way you do those those part actually. So here, I mean, like in this example, that is done. So it is the email example again, join mailing list. So basically you could start with the form. The form id is email form, action is join.html. So what you do here, if you go to the join, whatever action it is happening, it is happening once you click the form. So it will digest everything, it will go to the data e- email list, I mean email list, whatever it is, JavaScript, it will do its work, and then it will show a greetings. In principle, you can have some service call here, and which will basically redirect the input, I mean whatever the parameter, to the database, and it will save the email entries into the database, and we will get these greetings. But here we don't go to that level, it is the only front end class, so our scope is limited to the front end. So here is an event handler for the click event for of the submit button. You can see, I mean, this way you can also use the mailing list function, I mean the mailing list, I mean email list function. So you can do the join list, and then basically you can associate it with an event, and you do the event object, and then event object is defined in this way. So if you can don't allow, you may don't allow the form to be submitted by doing, if something happens, something unwanted thing happens, then you should not be able to submit the event, submit the form. So that's what it is done here. So that's what, I mean, the code elements are attached here. So whatever we have coded, that is attached here. So in this lesson we have learned the basic JavaScript operations associated with the function, and also we have defined different way of defining functions. We have used the anonymous function, we have used the functional interface, and then finally we showed some examples and some discussions around handling the events in the JavaScript. So that's all for today. We will have more interesting aspects of JavaScript during the incoming weeks. Okay, thank you.